Symposium, which constitutes highlights from all the contributors to the recently released book, Continuity and Change in Political Culture, Israel and Beyond, edited by Ilan Peleg, Saliba, Sarsar, and myself. The book is organized into 3 sections, and each of the sections will constitute a panel for the symposium today. The first panel mainly focuses on issues related to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second panel highlights challenges to democracy and divisions and visions within Israeli and American culture and society. And the third panel addresses creativity and imagination as they relate to facets of national memory, memorialization, and Germanization in Israel and the Basque Autonomous community in Spain and in Poland. I want to thank my fellow co-editors, Ilan Peleg and Saliba Sarsar, and contributors, Nadav Shelif, Yossi Bele, Naomi Chazan, Joel Migdal, Yael Zerubabel, Jan Kubik, and Roland Vasquez for their tribute to my dad, Mike Aronoff, in honor of his 80th birthday, and in honor of his many contributions to the comparative study of political culture, as well as political culture as applied in Israel. His work and mentorship has influenced many scholars and students. And we are living in a time of constant and often dramatic change in political cultures. Someone is calling me. I'm just going to ignore that. I apologize. And some continuities are shaped by conflict, internal and external divisions, and challenges to democracy. Mike Aronoff's important work on the interplay between politics and culture and the role in building important conceptual and methodological bridges between anthropology and political science help us to better understand how political culture in Israel and beyond is complex and complicated, and as he states, contested, contingent, and highly contextual. I want to thank our 11 co-sponsors at MSU. Many departments, colleges, and programs have supported the symposium. I want to thank Michael and Elaine Serling for their naming gift to our institute, which allowed us to focus more on Israel studies, and to Lauren Harris, whose Jonathan Netanyahu endowment has made this symposium possible. So just to clarify, each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. Because there are over 100 attendees to this symposium, unfortunately, we won't be able to answer everyone's questions, but if you write them in the Q&A, we'll try to collect several different questions or choose a couple questions for panelists to answer, and then we'll have a 10-minute break after each of the panels. And after the third panel, my dad, Mike Aronoff, will also make some of his own responses as he did in the epilogue to the book. So Ilan Peleg is going to chair this first panel. He's a co-editor, and Charles A. Dana Professor of Government at Law at Lafayette College, author of 11 books, founding editor of and chief of Israel Studies Forum, and past president of the Association of Israel Studies. So Ilan, you're going to be the timekeeper for us all, and you can give quick introductions and get us started. I don't see Ilan right now. Okay, Ariana, I think when we changed Mendelo's name, Ilan Peleg disappeared from the panel. So I don't know if you can help him get on again. So my apologies to everyone, but let's just take 30 seconds to do that. Is Ilan Peleg still logged in, Ariana? I don't know if you can tell. I'm just going to mute myself for a second to try to resolve this. Oh, there's Ilan. You're under the wrong name, but we can see you. So Ilan, if you could just give everyone real quick introductions and be a good timekeeper, and then we'll get started. You're muted, Ilan.
Okay, good morning to all of you. Can you hear me? Okay, good morning to all of you, wherever you may be, either in Europe or in Israel or in the United States. And welcome to the first panel of this important symposium dedicated to conflict and peace, two issues that have impacted Mike Aronoff's scholarship throughout his long career. We have 4 speakers this morning, and each of them will be limited to about 10 minutes. And I will introduce each of the speakers before their presentation. I will be extremely brief in order to maximize the speaking time available to each of the speakers. So the opening speaker is Professor Yael Aronoff of Michigan State University, where she's the director of the Serling Institute for Jewish Studies in Modern Israel. Yael is the author of The Political Psychology of Israeli Prime Ministers. She now serves also as the president of the Association for Israel Studies. Yael's topic this morning is Pathways to Peace, Legitimation of a Two-State Solution. Yael.
Welcome, everyone. So my dad, Mike Aronoff, has worked a lot on issues and conceptualization of legitimacy and its application to different political parties internally, social movements that challenge governments' national identities and the formation of those national identities. So I'm applying the concept of legitimacy to conceptualizations of different paradigms for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in looking at issues of legitimacy, I'm looking at the support of Israeli and Palestinian publics, as well as the rhetoric and support of international institutions and regional institutions and other international actors that provide kind of the basis for which these countries engage within the paradigm of a two-state solution, limit other conceptualizations for it, and constrain kind of the solutions that are discussed in international forums. So as many of you know, throughout most of the conflict, the two-state solution in which both nations' self-determination would be secured has been the main paradigm almost throughout the conflict, and of course was reinforced with the Oslo Accords of 1993 and 1995 that used that paradigm, even though they didn't specifically talk about two states. That was certainly the understanding, and we have one of the initiators and formers of that with us, Yossi Beilin, with us today. And that really set the stage for an increasing international acceptance and also regional acceptance for the two-state solution. And within this time, you see a lot of legitimacy for this as a paradigm growing in terms of the Israeli and Palestinian publics, for when often throughout the years, a majority of the Israeli publics supported this paradigm, and at different times during this 25 periods, there are periods when the Palestinian public did as well, and even in terms of the Clinton parameters or Geneva parameters that Yossi Beilin was also very much involved with. And often, certainly throughout most, a plurality of Palestinian public supporting this and increasing almost hegemonic support within the international community. That being said, there's been increasing kind of challenges to the legitimacy of a two-state solution in the past few years, given the many factors that we see, including kind of stagnation in the peace process, kind of a mobilization of the Israeli right and Netanyahu being in power so long, his building of increased settlements, support for ideas for unilateral annexation, which would include all settlements, of course, Hamas's control of the Gaza Strip, including divisions in both publics and parties, the lack of prioritization of this issue by the international community and regional actors, given other turmoil in the Middle East and other issues that crop up in terms of the need to balance Iran or the pandemic over the past year, which turned people's attention elsewhere. So you have many, many factors contributing to this sense of disillusionment and frustration, which has led to decreased support in the Israeli and Palestinian public for the two-state paradigm. And I think that in terms of assessing the legitimacy of paradigms, certainly the support of the publics on the ground is arguably the most important kind of factor and variable to assess the legitimacy of the paradigm. And you see here where at times I think the Israeli public support for the paradigm would be at 68%, 65%, 60%. Over the past couple of years, it's gone down to 58%. And with the Palestinian public, it has gone increasingly down to, as of last month, 40% support for the two-state paradigm. So in that sense, there is a real concern that the legitimacy of the two-state paradigm is being undermined. Now, if we look more closely at some of these figures, one can see a variety of things. One is that certainly it still relatively has more legitimacy than any one other alternative paradigm. So if we look at, for instance, support for a one-state solution, that's at 29%, I think, of last month polling among the Palestinian public. And that actually has not gone up in the last 4 years, but has gone down. And it certainly went up, support for two-state solution went up again a little bit after the election of Biden. And sometimes when in those surveys, when the question is asked differently, for instance, what do you support in terms of the solution to the Israeli-Palestinian factor? You have two states, one state confederation. In some of those questions, the support for one state is, the support for two states goes to 48%, even as last month. And the support for one state, I think, goes to something like 15% and confederation 10%. So it's even, the gap is much larger. So in that sense, the relative, even though the legitimacy of the two states has been undermined over the past 4 years, the relative legitimacy has still been maintained. And of course, there are other contributing factors to the decrease in Palestinian support. So people like Gaith Al-Amari, who used to be in the Palestinian Authority working for Abbas, and is now in the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and was on the American Task Force for Palestine, states that certainly, if you look at political polling, also the legitimacy of the PA and Abbas itself, of course, has been undermined with no elections in so many years and with perceptions of corruption being pretty high. So that often opposition to two states is not only measured by that, but by kind of a lack of legitimacy for those that are promoting it that contributes to that. Apart from, of course, those very important factors, you had the undermining of legitimacy that was contributed to, of course, by Netanyahu and Trump himself, for instance, and obviously Hamas as well. So the Trump peace plan and the concern for unilateral annexation on the part of Israel, which was a significant concern starting this past May, as well as the Trump peace plan, which was really kind of pulling the rug from out of the paradigm of the two-state solution and seriously threatening it, right? While previous negotiations over many years were assumed the framework that Israel would be keeping 3 to 6% of the West Bank or territory beyond 67 with equal swaps and with divisions or sharing of Jerusalem. The Trump peace plan completely undermined that by saying that Israel would keep it a minimum of 30% in all settlements. So there was a real, had Trump been reelected, there would have been a serious further undermining of the legitimacy of the two-state solution. However, with Biden's election, and I think I was looking at a quote of yours, Yossi Beilin, a little while ago that was kind of forecasting that perhaps if Biden was elected, perhaps the Trump peace plan would just be a piece of paper that would be blowing by the wayside that we forget about pretty quickly, and there would be a real return to this two-state paradigm. And in fact, one could argue that because of these real concerning challenges and remaining challenges to the two-state paradigm, there's actually been a backlash to that, which reaffirms kind of the legitimacy of the two-state paradigm, right? You have the whole European Union and Congress and Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, and now with the new normalization agreements, even though not enough is being to utilize those agreements to get back to negotiations or to pressure the parties, which needs to be done, it's certainly kind of a strong reaffirmation among the international community and regional community of the preference and support for the two-state paradigm in reaction to significant threats to it, right? So that doesn't mean that we can be complacent, but it does mean that there is no alternative paradigm. So even our colleague, Ilan Lustig, who's written a recent book about kind of that the two-state kind of paradigm has been lost, even his strong opposition and fears about it acknowledge that right now there is no other, paradigm that exists. And I don't have time to go into kind of the other challenges to why the alternatives seem to face even more challenges than the two-state solution does. So looking forward, a lot of this will depend on kind of leadership, of course, in Israel and in Palestine and in the United States in terms of how they can themselves shape public opinion among Israelis and Palestinians, as this is the most important factor to keep, unless there's progress, there'll be, we could foresee a continuing deterioration in support among Israelis and Palestinians that will, eventually perhaps allow room for more alternatives. So I'm stopping it here to keep to my 10 minutes since I was telling everyone else to. And we, of course, are just kind of skimming above some of the highlights of each of our chapters to hopefully give you a taste for it to read the book if you haven't already.
Thank you very much, Yael, for a wonderful presentation and keeping to the 10 minutes limit. The second speaker this morning is Professor Saliba Sarsar of Monmouth University in New Jersey. Born and raised in Jerusalem, Saliba is the author of Peace Building in Israel-Palestinian Relationships, Jerusalem, the Home of Our Hearts, and What Jerusalem Means to Us, Christian Perspectives and Reflections. Saliba will speak this morning on memory, identity, and peace in Palestinian-Israeli relationships. Saliba.
Thank you, Ilan. Good morning or good afternoon to all of you. And it's a great honor to be with you and to share my ideas about the interconnections between memory and identity in Israeli-Palestinian relations. My objective is to understand how the two traumas of the Holocaust and of the Nakba influence Israeli Jews and Palestinians respectively, and how they think, behave, and relate to each other. What are memories? What is identity? Memories, our own and those we share with others, are forged by history and are essential for our identity. We can be confined by memory or gain insight from it. When confined, we view history as a burden. When liberated, however, our knowledge of the past usually has a redemptive quality to it, which can be creative and empowering. Identity is the lifeblood of belonging, of social existence. Collective identity brings people together, which is based on their connective tissues of land, history, culture, religion, common values, mutual sentiments, among others. To bolster collective identity and cohesion and to ensure the proper remembrance of traumas and triumphs, we extend ourselves, developing the common symbols of a national anthem and national flag, creating national heroes, traditions, and museums, and engaging in rituals as in celebrations and commemorations. However, parties in conflict have a tendency to marginalize or even purge the other's identity and memory from their own memory and psyche. They rush to beautify their face while they disfigure the face of the other. Obviously, there is a need to change our individual and collective identities. This necessitates, as the late Dan Bar-On argued, internal processes of dialogue on each side, and these will reinforce the external dialogues between the parties in conflict. There is also the issue of promoting reconciliation, normally requiring expressions of security or peace, new relationships, regard for the other, truth, justice, mercy, and forgiveness. Participating in dialogue and reconciliation can serve as positive, albeit painful, means of reconstructing memory in the service of understanding and individual and social justice. The Holocaust, or Shoah in Hebrew, is the systematic persecution and mass murder of 6 million Jews and countless others by Nazi Germany and its collaborators. And Nakba, Arabic for catastrophe, marks the devastation that befell the Palestinian community as a result of the events surrounding the 1948 war. Now, let me state that there is no qualitative or quantitative equivalence between these two traumas. Both differ in nature and in degree. However, each provides a crucial reference point and a vital narrative for its own national community and for others. The Holocaust, as Julia Chaitin states, has generated in Jewish Israelis a continued fear of annihilation, which in turn directly connects it to the Palestinian-Israeli Arab-Jewish conflict. For the Palestinians, the Nakba, in the words of Ahmad Saadi, has come to symbolize the loss of homeland, the disintegration of society, the frustration of national aspirations, and the beginning of a hasty process of destruction of their culture. Most Israeli Jews commemorate the Holocaust on their own and do not acknowledge a Nakba or empathize with its victims. Many Palestinians are caught between denial of the Holocaust and little to no knowledge about it. One reason pertains to their struggle against Zionism and Israel, which color how the Holocaust is viewed. For the Palestinians, accepting Jewish pain around the Holocaust means accepting the moral ground for the creation of the State of Israel. For the Israeli Jews, accepting the pain of the 1948 Palestinian refugees means sharing responsibility for their plight and the right of return. In reaching out to understand the other's narrative, individuals and groups have faced a variety of reactions based on context, on timing, message, among others. Let me share with you two examples. Many of you experts and others are familiar with these, but let me put them in the context of my presentation. There is an example of Father Emil Shofani, who is an Israeli Arab Christian theologian, educator, and peace activist. His grandfather and uncle were killed by the Israeli army during the 48 war. In May 2003, he led 300 Israeli Arabs and Jews on a multi-faith pilgrimage to the historic city of Krakow and the Auschwitz-Birkenau Nazi death camp in Poland, where over 1 million Jews were murdered. Then he told the group, quote, "We are here to be with the Jewish people in all its history and all its suffering. From the suffering of our people today, we unite with your suffering." Father Shofani won the UNESCO Prize for Peace Education in 2003, and in 2014, he was given the annual award of the French Amitié Judéo-Chrétienne for advancing Christian, Jewish, and Jewish-Muslim relations. This is one example. Now look what happens when Professor Muhammad Ajani Daoudi, founder of the Wasatiyya movement of moderate Islam, who also was head of the American Studies Department and director of the library at Al-Quds University in Jerusalem. In March 2014, he organized a trip to Auschwitz for his students with the objective of learning more about the Holocaust and teaching tolerance and empathy. He was denounced as a traitor and collaborator. His car was torched and he lost his job at the university. For Dajani Daoudi, Holocaust denial and distortion are morally unacceptable, historically incorrect, factually wrong, and constitute a major threat to ethics and human dignity, as well as the prospect of reconciliation and peace between Palestinians and Israelis. So you see here two examples, two Palestinians, one Israeli, one Palestinian Arab, who engaged in reconciliation, and the reaction was totally different based on the context, the timing, the message, the nuance. Now, there are groups and there are many individuals, and I want to pay respect and acknowledge someone who doesn't need any introduction, Gershon Baskin of IPCRI, who has devoted his life to peace building. And there are many, many others. And in my book, Peace Building in Israeli-Palestinian Relations, I highlight several of these individuals and organizations. I studied about 54 such organizations. There are dozens of them. One of them, for instance, is Zochrot, Hebrew for remembering, which promotes acknowledgement and accountability for the ongoing injustices of the Nakba. Also, there is an interesting project which I use a product of. It's called Side by Side. It's a book that was done by the organization called Prime. And Prime developed a history of Arabs and Israelis, including the talk about the Holocaust and the talk about the Nakba, putting them side by side. So my students would read on the right and on the left those narratives, and then the middle is left open for the students to write in their comments. Now, the Parent Circle Families Forum, which is a grassroots organization of Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinian families that have lost immediate family members due to the conflict, also have a parallel narrative project that brings different groups of Israelis and Palestinians together to learn about the personal and national narratives of the other. Now, let me explain, and I'm concluding in 1 minute. The record is more mixed at the national level, and it raises concerns. In Palestine, there is a strong anti-normalization campaign with Israel. And in Israel, there is a nation-state law that excludes Palestinian citizens of Israel from the national identity and demotes Arabic from its status as an official language. In conclusion, while there is a strong tendency to cling to memories and identities, or to turn memories and identities into weapons for victory over the other, there is a fervent call for common ground of accepting limits. Through empathy and generosity of spirit, I strongly argue, both Israeli Jews and Palestinians can acknowledge each other's traumas in a multidimensional way. What is multidimensional? It means not one trauma at the expense of or in opposition to the other. So they must acknowledge each other's trauma in a multidimensional way, which will enable them ultimately to recognize the face, identity, and story of the other in their hearts and minds and seek true peace. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saliba, very much for this wonderful presentation. The next speaker, Professor Nadav Shelif, is a Harvey Meyerdorf Professor of Israel Studies at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Nadav is the author of Homelands, Shifting Borders and Territorial Disputes, and Evolving Nationalism, Homeland Identity and Religion in Israel, 1925-2005, both published by Cornell University Press. Nadav's topic this morning is denationalization in the Israeli-Palestinian context. Nadav.
Thank you, Ilan. Thanks, Yael. It's wonderful to see all of my colleagues here. So I kind of want to speak very briefly. I want to make sure that we have enough time for a real sort of discussion with the audience and among the other panelists. But my, I think, attempt in this chapter is to try and take the big lessons, at least I took from Mike's career and body of work, and see if we could apply them to these conversations about two states, sort of two-state, I don't like the word solution, I prefer sort of some sort of accommodation, and maybe what the alternatives are. And I sort of pick up where Yael left off and trying to think about what happens if we take those alternatives seriously, right? And sort of what would need to happen for them to take place, right? Because if we're going to judge the relative merits or relative plausibilities of different kinds of accommodations, then I think we need to take the full panoply of things that would have to happen for them to work out into account. And one of the big lessons that I took from Mike's work that sort of shaped the way I think about these things is, as Saliba noted, that culture and ideology matter, right? And they matter a great deal for how people see the world and what they do in it, and that they can change, right? And so if we take those two things in combination and sort of try and think about what would have to happen if a two-state solution, or for one of the alternatives, a two-state solution to actually take place. The reason that a lot of us, including me, my work to date, have focused on two-state solutions, including some of the political actors that we have here, is because it seems to be relatively easier to divide territory than to deal with the other stuff, right? With the other things that people want out of this conflict. This, in fact, is what the Peel Commission decided in 1937. Right? They said the Jewish national aspirations and the Arab national aspirations are indivisible, therefore we have to try and divide the land. Right? That was their diagnosis. More or less, that's where we still are. But I want to sort of try and think through systematically what it would take to divide those other aspirations. And just to get to the bottom line now, so that nobody's in suspense, I'm quite skeptical about how easy that those other kinds of transformations are. Not that they're impossible. I think they're certainly possible, and there are constellations in which they could take place, but they still strike me as harder to do than the even incredibly difficult and maybe impossible task of dividing territory. So trying to systematize some of how we think about what would have to happen, I focus on a process that I think is usually ignored by proponents of alternatives to a two-state solution, which is that either Israelis or Palestinians, or both usually, are expected to give up their nationalism or some key component of their nationalism. Right? They either have to adopt a different political identity, one, say, to use Gaddafi's phrase, Israelis, right? So we're no longer Zionists, we're no longer Palestinian nationalists, now we belong to the same political community. They have to replace it, right? The desire for a group to have control of their political destiny with a different form of political community, right? So say not nationalist, but say religious, right? Where we don't really care about political control of our political destiny, and we just want some sort of autonomy for our religious community. Or we can have a different goal, right? We can what I call in this chapter downshifting, right? Where instead of total control of our political destiny, we're willing to share, right? We're willing to cede some of that control, and so instead of having our own state, we're going to find some way of sharing power with another group. Now, when you put what's going on in Israel and in Palestine in comparative perspectives, we see evidence for each of these kinds of downshifting in other contexts. They do happen, right? So they're by definition not impossible, right? There are lots of episodes of abandoning one identity for a bigger overarching identity or a different smaller identity. Those kinds of shifts do happen. There are shifts from national identities to other kinds of political communities and making those more important than the national one. And there are episodes of downshifting, right? Where a group says, we want control of our political destiny, and for whatever reason, it doesn't happen, and so we abandon it and we do something else, right? We find some way of a different set of goals. And so in the chapter, I go into some of these into greater detail and see what that happened. And so I think the short version, because the takeaway of trying to figure out how these changes might come about in Israel or in Palestine, or among Israelis or among Palestinians, is just that the hurdles that would have to be overcome seem to be quite great. In fact, as great as the hurdles in dividing Israelis and Palestinians into two separate states, which I confess sadly leaves me incredibly pessimistic in ways that I think it doesn't matter who the U.S. administration is in that regard. So, it's, for example, hard to imagine either Zionists or Palestinian nationalists deciding to abandon their current affiliation with another one, if only because their existing identity categories structure the relative value of alternatives, right? If being a Zionist is who you are, right, then or being a Palestinian is who you are, it becomes that much harder to shift those. Now, it's possible for movements advocating a new identity to form and defeat the nationalists, but this seems unlikely. Some of the public opinion evidence that Yael cited suggests that there's almost no support for it now, either among Israelis or perhaps more surprisingly, even among Palestinians, right? Where a growing but still relatively small fraction of the population supports something like an accommodation that includes full equality for Jews and Arabs in whatever political entity exists, right? So even in that context, it again could happen. It could happen if there's an alliance between, for example, secular, what are sometimes called post-Zionist Jews, non-Zionist Haredim, and citizen Palestinians, so it's inside Israel, right? One could imagine a constellation of that kind of political movement. So it's conceivable, but it seems awfully hard to imagine. And the politician that would have to come up to craft that kind of coalition and bridge lots of those other gaps that exist there has yet to arise, right? Doesn't mean it can't happen in the future, but seems unlikely. Replacement with religious identities seems, which is the biggest or the most prominent alternative to nationalist identities, also seems unlikely. Those exist. They exist among Palestinians, they exist among Jews in Israel. But whenever religious identities and the nationalist identities have clashed, at least to date, the nationalists have won. And so the two biggest examples of this that we see, for example, even among Israeli Haredim, right, the ultra-Orthodox who are, at least in theory, most predisposed to be non-nationalists and focused on their religious identity, half of them say that they're actually, or consider themselves to be Zionists, right? And so even there, right, it's hard to see that the religious identity completely devolving the national one. Among Palestinians, right, the emergence of Hamas is evidence of the combination of nationalism with a religious identity. In fact, taking what had been a quiescent religious identity and say, no, the nationalist element is more important, right? That's the dominant one, and that's how we religious actors can participate in Palestinian politics. Now, finally, downshifting, again, is possible, but it's hard to envision, in part because real downshifting requires a belief in full equality in whatever accommodation comes about. I'll go out on a limb and say that even in any kind of accommodation that exists, there are likely to be continued deep structural differences between Jews and non-Jews in whatever thing whatever thing emerges, right? Whatever unitary or non-two-state solution emerges. And in that context, it's incredibly hard to prevent nationalists from continuing to gain power because their story that you are discriminated against because of who you are continues to resonate, right? And that appeal for separateness will continue to assert itself. And just by way of historical example, by analogizing from a very different case, the Scottish, even after 400 years of unitary statehood in Great Britain, right, because of this persistent discrimination, this idea of a separate nation existing within this other category hasn't gone away. And I wouldn't expect it to go away in this context. In fact, the inequality that I would foresee means that I think it's that kind of downshifting is unlikely to take root at base. So I'll stop here. I'd love to hopefully use this as a beginning for a conversation about these topics.
Thank you, Nadav, very much. So our last speaker hardly needs an introduction, but I will introduce him anyway. Okay, Dr. Yossi Beilin is a former student of Mike Aronoff, like several of the speakers here today, including myself. Dr. Beilin has been involved in pushing for Israeli-Palestinian reconciliation for over 30 years. His activities led to the historic Oslo Accord and to the Geneva initiatives, among others. Dr. Beilin served as in several Israeli governments. Among other roles, she served as deputy foreign minister, during the Oslo Accords, and later on as Justice Minister. Dr. Balin will speak this morning about the ecological fallacy, trust in international relations, the case of the settlement freeze in the Oslo process. Yossi.
Thank you very much. Just one thing, I mean, I was Mike's student, but the point is that I have been his student for the last 50 years, and I will always see him as my teacher. So the issue of age here is nice, but not prominent for me. It will be 90, 100 years, whatever. I'll still be his student. The issue of trust has been for me a kind of a problem in negotiations. And I thank Yael for inviting me to writing a piece in the book and to participate here, because I actually had to find ways and means to deal with the issue, which was there in my brains, but I had never written about it before. The point is that we all study and teach that trust is very important in negotiations, in international negotiations, that without trust, you can have nothing. It is an assumption, it is so obvious for us that perhaps we did not think enough about it, because when I tried to see the material in science about it, there are references to the issue of trust, of course, but there is no big library about the issue of trust. It's like you have to speak the same language, or at least to have an interpreter in the room when you negotiate. Yeah, this is obvious. You cannot speak in different languages, so you must have trust. And in my own story, I felt that there was something missing there about trust, because trust, when we refer to it, is too general. The question is, trust what? Trust in whom? And maybe sometimes you found out that there is excessive trust, which may be harmful for both sides. Now, usually we tend to equate personal trust with international trust. I mean, you buy a second-hand car, you see the owner of the car, you talk with him or with her, and you say to yourself, you know what, I trust him or her, that they are not concealing any kind of a car accidents or whatever in the history of this nice car. It is not just the issue of color. I trust him. You know, I have a sense, you know, these people who always have a sense to understand the others after one glimpse. So yes, they understand the people, the other side, and they trust the owner of the car. But this is not the case in our story. And here maybe there is the big problem or the big mistake. Now, we negotiated with the Palestinians in Oslo, and we became very friendly with them. It didn't take long in order to understand that neither them nor us had horns. We didn't need with all due respect, the stage of people to know each other, to understand that the other side is human like yourself. They have the same problems and the same kind of families, and eventually you can talk to each other on an equal basis. No, I think that both of us had known it even before. It was not a surprise, and that is why it was quite easy to trust each other and to know that the other side is not cheating you. When it says to you something like, we are sure that something like that is not possible, is not easy for our leaders to accept, or things like that, that they really meant it. Now, at a certain point, we had to touch the issue of settlements. And on the Palestinian side, there was a request which was not unexpected, that during the negotiations towards the permanent solution, I mean, the 5 years, which never ended regretfully, we will just freeze the settlements, whatever it means. Because as you know, there are many details, what does it mean, this freeze? But generally speaking, to freeze the settlements. On our side, it was like preaching to the choir. I mean, for so many years, we had talked about against the settlements. So if the other side, the bad side, the enemy is saying, you must freeze the settlements, it was like, okay, what else? And then we talked to the prime minister, to Rabin. And Rabin said to us, you know, we took a decision in '92. One of the first resolutions of the government was resolution number 360. I will never forget this number. And this was an Israeli initiative to stop settlements, to stop the public buildings. It was very detailed, and it is not all the settlements, all the buildings in the settlements, but the public buildings and the planned buildings. It was not an easy resolution, especially when he had a very small coalition. And this was one of the main symbols of Rabin's government, to say this was our initiative, because we had a different kind of priorities, and the building settlements was not one of our priorities. He said, you know, if the Palestinians are coming and saying, now you will have to freeze settlements, as if they force us to do something against our will, it will be problematic, not only because it is not against our will, and we already decided to do that, but because if you say it, it's like poking in your eye, in the eyes of the other parties which joined us in the coalition of '92, the ultra-religious Shas party, which eventually left us. And his request was that we will go back to the Palestinians and say, you can trust Rabin. I mean, the guy is not going to build in the settlements. Look at resolution 360 and don't put us in an impossible situation whereby we have to submit to your request, although we understand that it is very important for you to say, you know, look at the agreement, we actually demanded the freeze of settlements and we succeeded. And what happened was that during the negotiations, they accepted our demand. Now, for the negotiators, for the Israeli negotiators, it was a kind of a success. We could go back to Rabin and say, Mr. Prime Minister, your demand was accepted. The Palestinians gave up on it. And the substitute for it was that no side will take unilateral steps which would undermine the permanent agreement. And in a Talmudic way, in a scholastic way, it is actually a hint to the issue of settlements. So it was a success. It was a result of trust. The Palestinians trusted us. We did not come to the negotiations in order to build more settlements behind the mask of an agreement with the Palestinians. And Rabin was sincere in his wish not to build more settlements. And everything was okay. But Rabin could not promise them not to be assassinated. And he was. And there were elections. And another government was elected. And another prime minister by the name of Netanyahu. And he wanted very much to build settlements. And he did. So the world, and first and foremost the Palestinians themselves, said, hey, this is against the spirit of Oslo. And Netanyahu said, show me the spirit. I mean, I read it and reread it. I don't like this paper, but you know, it became an international document. So I will follow it by the word. Literally, show me a sentence which says no more settlements. And of course, there was no one. So eventually, I think that we all paid the price for this kind of victory that we had for Rabin's wish. Because settlements were built, the Palestinians for sure did not like it, and the peace camp in Israel was against it. And eventually it seems like a real impediment on the way to the two-state solution. I don't believe that this will be the impediment. I believe that if you have the real leadership on both sides, you will have the solution and you will implement it. But for sure, it makes it much more difficult for any Israeli leader to think about evacuation of so many settlers from the West Bank. And that means that one has to redefine the issue of trust. The trust is not necessarily in the people who sit in front of you around the table. You have to take into account, and they have to take into account, that even if they are really sincere, real sincere people, and this is not obvious, but let's imagine that they are sincere in what they say, and they are not trying to deceive you or to manipulate you. The question is whether you can also trust those who sent them, because they are not around the table. And as you know, part of the negotiations is between the negotiators and their leaders. And eventually you have a table which has one cause to succeed in the negotiation, and people help each other on both sides of the table, and both of them are negotiating with the leaders in order to say that the compromises are not as awful as the leader may be afraid of. But in that case, I mean, it is very important to trust the other negotiations. It is very important to trust the leaders and believe that they can deliver. And it is very, very important to trust the system and believe that the leaders, when they say that they can deliver, can really deliver. Since it is so difficult to trust all these levels, you must not be blinded by the trust to the other side and say, no way, we trust you personally that you are sincere. But we want it to be very clear that once there is an agreement, there is no more settlements. Now, it is very strange for me to say something like this, I mean, to tell the other side, you know, we could not deliver what we promised you. So next time, please be tough on us. But it is mutual. And what I say is that next time when we seriously meet together in order to get to the permanent agreement, which I believe can be very soon, but I'm afraid that it won't. But when it happens, both sides should not be deceived by their intention to trust the other side, but insist on what is really important for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Yossi Berlin, very much. I think that we are probably out of time for this particular panel. And my suggestion, Yael, Yael, I cannot hear you.
Yeah, sorry. I would still take maybe 10 minutes. I mean, I know we were 5 minutes late in getting started to allow people to get on. So I would take 10 minutes just for a couple questions, and anyone who wants to respond within the panel or within the symposium to each other. So I only saw 2 questions in the Q&A. One was from Oded Chiklai, which was a very good question. Isn't the kind of status quo a real kind of alternative in terms of legitimacy? And I can take a stab, and others could take a quick stab at that. And then by Michael Serling about how we could maybe move from some of the normalization agreements with that happened recently in the Trump administration, and perhaps use them moving forward. So I think that's an excellent question on the part of Oded, in the sense that I think that surveys do show that still kind of support for 2 states is significantly higher than maintaining a status quo. But in effect, if you look at some of the other questions, which is, do you think the 2 states is actually going to happen, much less anytime soon? And do you think the other public supports it? Then you see a much decreased kind of sense of whether it's actually going to happen. And of course, if you look at actual behavior in terms of the longer the status quo perhaps is in existence, the longer, in a sense, I think Oded is right, it establishes and galvanizes kind of a legitimacy of its own, or kind of this incorrect understanding among many that it can be sustained. And you can see that, as I was saying, with even political parties in Israel no longer talking as much about 2 states, even though if you look at data, even at least a third of a lot of the parties on the right support 2 states, or several of them. So I think that's a real kind of issue, that a question that Oded poses, whether practically speaking, kind of the status quo maintains a reality of its own. And some of the things, I think Michael Serling's question, and some of the things that Saliba was referring to in his talk, and even Yossi Berlin in his talk, can move us forward into what needs to be done to step off of the status quo in terms of the mutual empathy and understanding and historical understanding that Saliba was talking about, but also tachlis, what needs to be done in future negotiations on the ground, that Yossi Berlin perhaps was moving to in terms of lessons learned. And I think one of the trade-offs, as we all know, with some of the normalization agreements that happened recently, is that on one hand, it can perhaps leave some room for the Palestinians and Israelis, but also Palestinians, to perhaps be more willing to accommodate in the future, right? If they have future states, or perhaps Saudi Arabia in combination with Jordan, Egypt, allowing them or giving them a space to make more difficult accommodations if they're pressed to do so, and where they know that, oh my goodness, the alternative could have been so much worse than, let's say, the Olmert's 2008 offer or something building off of that. And likewise, by perhaps those in the center left in Israel who could see kind of the danger of unilateral annexation lurking, that again, from a stance of hope, those normalization agreements and future relationships could be galvanized to actually move to perhaps towards renewed negotiations and things on the ground. But I'll let others also with my colleagues with more experience, and also Yossi Beilin and Naomi Chazan with more practical experience in terms of the politics of it all. If anyone else wants to weigh in onto those two questions or respond to anything else that was said in the panel. Oh, I see there's a couple more questions as well that are now cropping up. So let's start with that, and then I'll raise their questions. I don't know if anyone else has any responses.
Yeah, I would say very quickly that we have a number of major situations in international relations that are seemingly unmaintainable and unsustainable, and nevertheless they have been with us since the 1940s without a resolution, just like the West Bank since 1967. One is the situation of Taiwan, and the other one is a situation in Kashmir. So in both situations, for all sorts of reasons that I don't have time to go into, the structural situation, if you will, did not enable the parties to move forward in terms of resolution. So I think this puts the West Bank situation into a broader historical international context.
Okay.
Other comments?
I see just two other questions that cropped up. One was from Steve Geckler, I think to you, Nadav, and how do you navigate all these multi-identities and perhaps, strengthening accommodation, as you said, rather than the word solution. And I also see another question for Yossi Beilin as to how one can, you were warning against kind of putting too much trust in your fellow negotiators and what you said in terms of the possible change of governments that it can occur. But this questioner was also asking, when you do, under the conditions where you do need to build trust in the leader that you mentioned is also necessary at certain times, how do you go about trying to do that? So, and I think after those two questions, unless there are other kind of responses among the panelists, then we'll move to our 10-minute break so that we don't stray too far from our schedule.
Sure, so I'll take a stab on Steve's question. Thank you. So as I sort of understand that the question says, look, all of us have multiple identities, right, that always have to be negotiated. And so how do we handle that in the context of these maybe issues that may impede a two-state solution? So, I think the biggest impediment, or there are lots of impediments to the two-state solutions, but as sort of Yossi Beilin put it, I don't think that they are insurmountable. I think that the coalitions needed to do that are difficult to do, but to my mind, they involve territorial issues, which can be bound up with identity and are in this context, but in themselves are, I think, potentially resolvable, right? Since it's possible to trade other really important issues for territorial ones. We see that in lots of contexts. I think the difficult thing is to figure out, and this is a question for the political leaders that we have sort of among us, is how one thinks about crafting the kind of coalition that can withstand the changes that Beilin articulated, right? So you reach an agreement, the context changes, right? But if you support the end of that agreement, you still have to maintain people's buy-in into that, and maybe a wide enough range to sustain those kinds of changes. And that's not I think the gist of what I was saying is that those are incredibly difficult to sustain. And that's one of the reasons that for the inability to reach an agreement to date. But I also think it's one of the things that will challenge any of the alternative proposed accommodations that are out there. And I would like you, Steve, I would like us to spend more time thinking through, right, and quite explicitly about how we harness, right, those various types of identities to reach that goal.
May I? We don't have too much time, so I must be a little bit bold. I think that the issue of trust is so evasive that some of the people are using it in order to say we cannot have real peace. We cannot. We have to build trust. First of all, bottom up. people to people and all these things. And only then, maybe in 100 years, in 200 years, we may have peace. I don't dismiss the importance of trust, but I believe that it is operating in a different way. Take, for example, the peace between Israel and Egypt. Whom did we hate more than Sadat? I mean, he was in charge of killing thousands of young people. Some of them were in my class in the university, my students. It was unbelievable what happened to us in the Yom Kippur War, in the 73 War. In one visit, he was more popular than the Israeli Prime Minister, Begin. Now, did it take a long while to build trust that we will understand that he was pro-Nazi, but he did not mean it or whatever? No, no, once he came, there was trust. Once he visited Jerusalem, once he talked in the Knesset, he was admired. And this is why, although I cannot dismiss the issue of trust, but trust is built during the process, not necessarily in order to enable the process of peace. And I really believe that we should not help those who do not want to have peace by agreeing all the time that we must build trust as if we know how to build trust. I don't think that we know.
There are other questions. We're kind of at least 15 minutes over of our schedule. So I'd recommend that we take a 10-minute break now. And so we'll resume at 12:20. That I'll introduce the panelists for the second panel on challenges to democracy and visions and divisions within Israeli and American political culture. So we're going to hear from Naomi Chazan and Ilan Peleg, and then Joel Migdal. Naomi Chazan, for some of our MSU folks, participated in our Israel at 70 conference a couple of years ago and made a great impression on everyone since she's a wonderful speaker. She's Professor Emerita of Political Science at Hebrew University of Jerusalem and currently serves as Senior Fellow at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute at the Harry S. Truman Research Institute for the Advancement of Peace. She's a former member of the Knesset from 1992 to 2003, past president of the New Israel Fund from 2008 to 2012, and has been active in a variety of human rights, peace, and women's organizations for over 4 decades. She has written and edited 9 books and over 70 scholarly articles. And her latest publication is an edited volume with Michal Shamir and Hannah Herzog, has been published in Hebrew. And they wrote Gender Gap in Israeli Politics. Then we're going to hear from Ilan Peleg, and he's the author of 11 books and over 90 scholarly essays, former president of the Association of Israel Studies, founding editor of the Israel Studies Forum, the scholarly journal of the Association of Israel Studies. And among his books are Democratization, the Hegemonic State, and Israel's Palestinians, a Conflict from Within, which form the basis for some of his comments today. And he's also written on Menachem Begin and on human rights in the West Bank and Gaza, and just co-edited a book to which I contributed, The Victimhood Discourse in Contemporary Israel, and is a scholar at Washington's Middle East Institute and is the Charles A. Dana Government and Law Professor at Lafayette College. And then we're going to hear from Joel Migdal, who's kind of one of our more famous academics, since most academics don't get famous, I think, within academia. And he's the Robert F. Phillip Professor of International Studies in the University of Washington's Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. He was a founding chair of the University of Washington's International Studies program, former professor of government at Harvard University and lecturer at Tel Aviv University. And among his famous books are Strong Societies and Weak States, and as well as The Palestinian People, A History, Shifting Sands, the United States and the Middle East. Joel talked to one of my classes who read his book at MSU, and it's a wonderful book. And he received the University of Washington's Distinguished Teaching Award and the Governor's Writers Award. He's a professor emeritus and formerly the Robert F. Phillip Professor of International Studies at the University of Washington. So we have very, very honorable, knowledgeable, and experienced panelists, and I think it'll be really enriching discussion. So just keep to your 10 minutes, which I think we managed to do in the previous panel. So Naomi, you go first.
Thank you.
And just a reminder that you can write your questions in the Q&A, and then I'll try to get to some of them at the end of the panel.
Thank you very much. Good evening from Jerusalem. Mike, it's a pleasure to be here on this occasion for you. I was never your direct student, but you've been my teacher for years. So it's an honor and a privilege to be part of this book and to be with all our colleagues. I wrote my article. I think I was the last person to submit an article exactly a year ago. And it was essentially about Israel's democratic recession during the past decade. And I find myself in a very unusual position today because the past year has simultaneously witnessed two processes. One, the intensification and amplification of the backsliding of Israeli democracy that I analyzed in the article. And at the same time, the development of additional elements which were very difficult to imagine a year ago, just before the COVID-19 pandemic began to hit us with all its ramifications. So what I'll do very briefly is run through the basic elements of what's been taking place in Israel up to this year and some additions about changes that have occurred as well. And I'll start with something very, very simple and very clear, in a sense to dispel the notion that until recently, Israel has been a liberal democracy. It hasn't. Its democratic roots are very fragile. And if you look carefully at the Declaration of Independence, the word democracy does not appear. During the first 3 decades of Israeli independence, Israel was a highly competitive political system, but its institutional structure had certain checks and balances, but liberal democratic norms were not very deeply embedded, and that's being polite. In a sense, liberalism began to appear on the Israeli political scene really only after 1967, increased the growth of civil society and struggles for individual rights, civil rights, and human rights during the 1980s and peaked during the Oslo period in the 1990s. For the past 20 years, there was stagnation, but over the past 11, 12 years, there has been a process of clear democratic recession. So let's not start with a stereotype that doesn't exist, but we have to understand that there has been a real deterioration in Israeli democracy in recent years. And it's taken 3 very clear forms. What has deteriorated? First of all, there has been a growth of serious liberalism in Israel, very systematically, since 2009, 2010, but with increasing acceleration during the past 3-4 years. That means a reduction in individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of organization, and collective rights, especially minority rights, with Arab citizens of Israel primarily being the main target, but by no means the only target. Women across the board, other marginalized groups, Ethiopian Israelis, one example. I could give many others. The second element of this process of democratic recession, it relates not to rights, but relates to neo-authoritarian tendencies and institutions. And here we have a systematic chipping away at the constitutional basis of Israeli institutions, state institutions. By the way, also of the role of the Knesset in Israel's parliamentary democracy, but most noticeably, almost direct attacks on the guardrails of Israeli democracy, primarily the judiciary, also the opposition. In other words, the checks and balances in the system have been severely upset, and the watchdogs have been purposely weakened. Civil society organizations, the media, most prominent among these. Having said that, the third element of this process relates to populism, the real growth of populism in Israel, which clearly preys on feelings of resentment, of neglect, of discrimination, or felt discrimination in certain quarters, and has been highlighted by a very strong rhetoric of us versus them. By the way, culminating in the nation-state law, which makes it very clear that there is us, very ethnocentric view of Israel and what Israel is all about, and them, anybody who dissents from this kind of approach. If you put the three elements together, illiberalism, chipping away at rights, neo-authoritarianism, no checks and balances and problems of accountability, and populism, you have a very clear triangle that has adversely affected Israeli democracy until a year ago, to the point of challenging entirely its liberal foundations and leaving a very formal competitive system with next to no liberal trappings. It's gotten worse in the past year. And it's gotten worse in the past year because some segments of Israeli society, especially the Haredim, have gained a great deal of autonomy to the point that they operate at will. The capacity of the government to make decisions is next to nil, and there are severe problems of governance and governability. At best, during this past year, the government has proven that it is incapable almost of governing. So we have a really serious problem here, which is exacerbated by personal elements as well. Now, the process of how this occurred has been researched. I've elaborated it in the article. I just want to highlight 2 points. It started off very slowly, very contained, almost unnoticeable. And by the time people began to wake up to what was going on, the process of deterioration had accelerated beyond almost control. Today, there is an understanding that it is taking place. There is a clear pushback. Thousands are in the streets for the past 31 weeks every Saturday, but not only on Saturday, now almost every day. So clearly, there is a process. People understand that it's taking place, but there has not been a capacity to stem it. That's point number one. Point number two, during the past year, when people's personal situation and health, social situation, economic situation has regressed palpably, during this situation, the ability of the government to deal with anything has been next to nil. A lot of zigzagging, a lot of evasion, and a clear sense that things are clearly falling apart. I don't mean to scare anybody, but I do mean to say that the situation here, as by the way in many other democratic countries in the last year, has gotten worse. Now, having said that, there are explanations for what is going on. It's not always clear, by the way, whether trying to move into a situation of greater control is an objective in itself, or it's a means to achieve another objective. For example, control over the West Bank, or annexation, a political objective, or some may claim, if one closely examines the last year alone, a lot of what has been taking place has been the utilization of power, concentration and personalization of power in order to promote the interests of the person at the helm of government and to prevent his appearance even on indictment charges in court. So there are also personal explanations. But if we look at the bottom line, there's no question that however you want to explain what is going on, there is a process which has led us to a situation where the present government and leadership is less popular than ever before, but that democratic forces in Israel, which until recently have succeeded in maintaining a stalemate vis-a-vis the government, are probably less powerful than they were a year ago. Which leads us to the question, is Israel in the process of democratic collapse? What's the tipping point? Or, because it's facing elections in 6 weeks' time, is it on the verge of some kind of rehabilitation but it's not clear that that's what's happening because
you're
I'm
like a
finished.
prophet who I could listen to all day, but we're 3 minutes over, so I'm sorry that the only way.
I'm sorry.
I'm just letting you know to wrap it up.
Last sentence and last end of question. Or is what is taking place in order to change the leadership, there's actually a move to the right and not towards democratic rehabilitation. Thank you. And sorry for going over.
No, it's always a pleasure to hear you. So Ilan, you're next.
Thank you, Yael. Nomi Chazan spoke this morning about the dangers faced by Israeli democracy today. I totally agree with her analysis. I especially agree with Nomi when she talks about the systematic democratic decline in Israel and about Israel being among the first countries to exhibit signs of democratic recession. And those are both concepts that she has been using very sophisticatedly in the article that in the book in honor of Mike Aronoff. But I would like to carry Nomi analysis further, and particularly in a somewhat more specific manner. My paper deals with majority-minority relations in deeply divided societies that are democratic, or at least aspire to be democratic. I'm using Israel as a case study for analyzing much broader contemporary global trends. Deeply divided societies that are also democratic, even if inherently flawed democracies, as indeed Israel has been, are particularly interesting in terms of today's globalized struggle between two opposing forces. On the one hand, Western-style liberal democracy, and on the other hand, illiberal populist authoritarianism that very often masquerades as democracy. Israel has emerged, particularly over the last decade, as one of several countries that are somewhat, I would argue, in the middle, between the liberal democratic model on the one hand and illiberal polity in which populist and very often nationalist authoritarianism prevails. Other countries include Hungary, Turkey, Poland, Brazil, and others. Theoretically speaking, in democratic deeply divided societies, as against non-democratic deeply divided societies like China or Russia, for example, there is inherent political tension between two sets of contradicting forces. On the one hand, you have the demands of the majority to control exclusively the states, its public institutions, and its policies. On the other hand, you have the demand of minorities to be treated equally, as they are indeed in genuine liberal democracies, or maybe get their fair share of the pie, as indeed they may be in consociational democracies. In dealing with this challenge, the polity in deeply divided but democratic societies may adopt one or of two political strategies. First of all, an accommodationist and inclusive strategy responding to the demands of minorities for equality and protection. This is, for example, has been happening over the last 60 or 70 years in Canada, in Northern Ireland. It has always been part of the Scandinavian tradition, and so on and so forth. The accommodationist inclusive strategy. On the other hand, you have what I've been calling for quite some time, the hegemonic or exclusivist strategy, designed to enhance the privileged position of the majority. For example, here you can talk about Sri Lanka, you can talk about Turkey, and quite a lot of other cases as well. Traditionally, and very interestingly, I think theoretically, and of course I'm very committed to it also emotionally, Israel had adopted a hybrid strategy. This hybrid has been reflected already in the foundational Declaration of Independence that Naomi referred to before, and later on in the almost sacred, but to my way of thinking, problematical formula of Israel as Jewish and democratic. You can see that tension right there. In the context of my paper, Jewish is a particularistic adjective beneficial to the majority, while democratic is a universalistic adjective that applies to all Israelis and thus beneficial to minorities. And I would refer you to an article written by Mike Aronoff and Pierre Atlas on Jewishness and Israeliness, which I had the privilege to publish in one of my edited books. Importantly, in the past 20 years or so, despite Israel's formal hybridity, and here I'm in agreement with Naomi, the hegemonic alternative has emerged as the preferred option by many elements within Israeli politics. For example, you had amendments to the citizenship law banning West Bank Palestinians from acquiring Israeli citizenship through marriage to Israeli Arabs. By the way, something that has been approved by the Supreme Court of Israel in a 6-5 decision. Selection committees were established in communities. A Nakba law was passed to prevent its memorization, and on and on and on. But most importantly, and here again I'm following in Naomi's footsteps, in July 2018, the Knesset passed a basic law, Israel as a nation state of the Jewish people. The law to date is the clearest indication of the movement toward Jewish hegemony rather than the strengthening of civic equality within the Israeli polity. A series of top Jewish scholars of Israeli politics characterize the law as imposing inequality, as incompatible with modern constitutionalism, as transforming Israel from flawed democracy to illiberal majoritarianism, and so on and so forth. In many cases, hegemonic policies are carried out not only domestically, and I think that's an important thing to note, in matters such as religion, education, and culture, but also in foreign policy. In Israel, this is reflected in regards to the policy in the West Bank. In fact, some scholars believe that the July 2018 law lays the foundation for partial or complete West Bank annexation. Here again, Israeli right-wing behavior is quite similar to that of other nationalist movements. And I always look at things in a comparative kind of way, because I think the comparative approach allows us more analysis and less description. Look, for example, at Greater Serbia policy of Milovan Milosevic, Turkish neo-Ottomanism under Erdogan, Greek policy toward Macedonia, and so on and so forth. These are all foreign policy issues carried out in the name of ethno-nationalism in deeply divided societies that are, for the most part, democratic, right? Milosevic, Serbia was a democracy, Turkey is a half democracy, and on and on and on. You can look at so what I want to say is that majority-minority problems impact countries in a comprehensive manner. They cannot be automatically solved by the democratic character of the state. Democracy is not the solution, if you will. Moreover, these problems might actually destroy democracy by propelling populist authoritarian politicians to national leadership prominence. In other words, foreign policy issues, West Bank and so forth, Greater Serbia can actually help in the destruction of democracy. And again, I am not going to name names. I will let you fill in any names that you may want to fill in. So my last sentence here, I would say that the July 2018 legislation that I referred to and that Nomi referred to as well is merely one of the recent danger to Israel's already volatile, problematical democracy. Now, I would say, maybe to be a little bit on the positive side, that the appropriate solution or remedy for this particular law is for the Knesset to enact a full-fledged, comprehensive, basic law, civic equality. We don't have a basic law, civic equality. When the Supreme Court wants to emphasize equality, they have to go in a roundabout way to show that equality is actually a principle of the Israeli democracy. I would argue that such a basic law might restore a desirable balance to the Israeli policy. Thank you.
Thank you. And now Joel Migdal is going to bring us to the American context and history as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with all of you and to be particularly on this panel with Nomi and Ilan. Mike, I want to, first of all, congratulate you on a fantastic career and say that what I'm going to say really dates back to Mike's very first book, Frontier Town, in which he looked at some of the questions I'm raising in an Israeli context. And I was very inspired by that many years ago and continue to be today. So the article in the book that I wrote is part of a larger project I'm working on. I'm interested in how diverse, complex societies where people are packed together in cities and interact with people they don't know on a personal level every single day, how such a people can create a public. In that kind of a public that I'm talking about, people accord others they consider to be part of that public with respect. They treat them as familiar even when they're strangers. They deem them as safe, non-threatening. And they deem people who they consider to be outside that public with suspicion, seeing them as dangerous or somehow not genuine parts of the society or nation. And you can see the echo to what Nomi and Ilan were talking about with the nation-state law. So my project asks, who becomes part of the public and who's left on the outside? And how and why does that change over time? And the anxiety underlying that question.
You're all of a sudden muted, Joel.
Joel?
Okay, I'm sorry about that.
Good.
I hit the wrong button. The anxiety underlying the question I'm asking can be seen in the events in Israel over the last year particularly, but also in the US over what has happened in the last month. But the question goes back much farther than that, decades ago. So my focus in this project is on the United States, but many of the same questions, of course, can be applied to Israel. I have two central questions I'm asking. Why and how did a public emerge in the United States in the second half of the 19th century, just as serious urbanization in the country took off? And why were the rules and broad common concerns that took hold and lasted for nearly a century become so weakened in the second half of the 20th century? What happened? And particularly in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. Why has the public unraveled? Why is it disintegrated? In the United States, as in many other societies, including Israel, implicit rules for ordinary human relations and for dealing with issues of common concern are extremely important. Repeated ways of behaving in civic organizations, in workplaces, in shops, in walking in downtown streets, in participating in social clubs, even just going to the park. The way people behave is extremely important. And the behavior is not random. The behavior has a certain discipline to it. So these rules that guide how we walk on the right side of the sidewalk, even though there is no such law to walk on the right side of the sidewalk, these rules became established, often unspoken, and people began to cherish the way things were commonly done. And so the conscious and unconscious and subconscious rules that people adopt provide the medium for the acceptance of the other, of strangers, as partners in everyday social and economic transactions. If I can just say that one of the things that sort of spurred me toward this very long ago was when I first came to Israel in 1964. I saw a new immigrant go up to a kiosk and he ordered a sandwich. And he said to the owner of the kiosk, I'd like a sandwich. And the kiosk owner said, well, what kind of sandwich do you want? And the customer, who I think was from Kurdistan, said, I can't tell you what kind of sandwich. You are the more prestigious person. You have to tell me what sandwich you're going to give me. And just this kind of lack of communication and the sense of hierarchy that was built into this really made me very aware of the difficulty of establishing rules of acceptance of how people treat each other. Some people have tried to list all the rules in society. It's a fool's errand. The security that came out of these transactions that people had in the workplace and in public spaces in the United States enabled loftier interactions where Americans discussed, debated, deliberated about issues of general concern. The rules for commonplace behavior become the foundation for more elaborate shared credos concerning morality and democracy, freedom, and all kinds of other high-minded ideals. Now, in the particular article, I'm looking at the rise of cities and capitalism provoked it created a kind of boiling pot in which people were thrown together and had to develop these rules one way or another. And I looked in the paper at 3 kinds of tensions that 19th century American cities created. The first was intimacy and freedom. The city is a very interesting place. It's a place of glitz. It's a place of opportunity. And at the same time, cities are places that are considered to be licentious, dangerous, where people are afraid of others. And so somehow within the city, American urban centers created a kind of kernel of a public with common rules for everyday behavior, but it wasn't easy. There was always the exclusion of the other, the fear of the other that that lurked. The second tension was what I call segmentation and integration. Part of what happens in a city, and this is not only in modern cities, it's true in medieval cities as well, is that groups are thrown together in some kinds of places, like downtown, in shops, often in workplaces. And at the same time, residential neighborhoods exist, which are kind of like the quarters of medieval cities. They separate people into different ethnic and racial groups. And so you had, again, this tension of being thrown together and yet separate at the same time. And the third tension that I looked at was how various groups have tried in every period of US history to define special organic ties that link people to one another, which excludes groups. It excludes African Americans, it excludes immigrants, it excludes all kinds of groups at various times, and it defines what a real American is. And at the same time, there's the rhetoric of liberalism, which presents a very different view, not an organic view of how a society is put together, but a contractual view. Here, everybody is supposed to be equal. It doesn't matter what your gender is or your place of birth or your color or anything of the sort. What happened in the United States was that the dominant group, while trying to preserve a kind of organic, white, waspy hold on power, also had this rhetoric of liberalism. And so what they did is adopt what I call a kind of liberal exclusivity or liberal exclusivism. That means, yes, everybody could be part of the public, but you have to have certain qualities. You can't be too aggressive like Jews were. You can't accept authority from the outside like Catholics do. You can't be too impulsive like Italians are. You can't be too emotional the way women are, or too irresponsible like the Irish are. So what we have was a public with implicitly agreed rules for daily behavior that developed slowly over time, which among a core which excluded many, many people in the society. And it was a very fragile entity. That American public expanded from the middle of the 19th century until almost the end of the 20th century. But the place of immigrants and others as rightful members of that public has been violently and non-violently challenged in the 21st century. And it is led and symbolized by an American president who has shouted for those he considers not to be real Americans to go back to where they came from. Thank you.
Thank you to all three of you for pointing us to the real concerns of challenges to liberalism and democracy in Israel and historically in the US, either with its expansions, with backlashes to it recently. There was one question in the chat, and Nadav also had a question for Yossi Beilin, but I just wanted to point out that I think he said there were primary within the Labor Party today, and his son is one of the people running, so he was going to try to come in and out when he comes. So hopefully, I don't know if he'll be able to come back later. He lost.
Merav Michaeli just won.
We do have a question in the chat from my colleague Mark Bernstein to you, Naomi, as to whether you see some similarities between Bibiism and Trumpism, and whether there is any hope perhaps for Biden playing a role in thwarting further deterioration of democracy in Israel, as well as if there's any role, also because you were the president of the New Israel Fund. There's a lot of debates about whether there is a decline among American youth towards connection to Israel, and what influences, if any, they might have on the issues of challenges to Israeli democracy that you speak of. So we'll start off with those questions.
Thank you. For 4 years, there was no daylight between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu, virtually no daylight at all. And I think that's very well known. But there are differences between the two, and I think we're seeing them very clearly today. First of all, I want to make a distinction that everybody's making and really should make between Trump and Trumpism. Trumpism is not gone. And between Bibi and Bibism, even if Netanyahu does not continue to be prime minister for much longer, the process of Bibism still, or the phenomenon of Bibism, I think will be with us for a long time. Having said that, I'll say very quickly, I think Bibi has been looking very carefully at what has happened to Trump in the last few months, and he's drawing very clear lessons. He's learned from that. And if you notice, he's all of a sudden become a liberal. If I may, in quotes, a liberal in the sense that, first of all, a word that has been taboo for over a decade, peace, is now used all the time. And by the way, actual liberal forces in Israel can use that to deal with issues that have to do with the occupation, hopefully in the not too distant future. More importantly, he is directly courting now the Arab vote in Israel, because he understands that without moving a few seats from the center left to the right, he will not be able to knit together a government which he controls entirely. He's doing a very good job at that. In other words, under the guise of liberal democratic language and rhetoric, he is trying to achieve the same goals as Donald Trump did and didn't succeed in doing. And he's also doing a very good job in maintaining the fragmentation on the center left, which the center left is doing a good job at as well. So when I look at what's been happening, what you see is that Netanyahu, much more determined, by the way, in all probability, much smarter and very much more a political mastermind, especially in and around election season. So there are many analogies to be made. The outcomes might be quite different. But the second part of the question was also different. I think that as long as Netanyahu is in office, there's very little wiggle room that he will have vis-a-vis the Biden administration. And this is an opportunity to reintroduce certain elements that are related to Palestinian self-determination and to the discussion in the previous panel, and which we should look at that as well.
I'll just give a chance for if any panelists want to respond to each other or anyone in the symposium before we take our second break before the third panel. Does anyone?
If I may, just Oded Chaklai asked me a question in the question and answer, and I'll just, in 2 sentences, he asked what legislation and processes, policies support the notion of democratic recession. At the last count, there are over 120 laws that have been passed in the past decade in Israel that in one form or another, again, legislation, confine or restrict democratic rights or access and rights of certain groups within Israel, primarily Arab society in Israel. There are policies that do so as well. For example, land policies, building rights, which is a major source problem. And don't forget, there is a rhetoric that has developed, starting with the Arabs are moving in droves to the ballot box during the 2015 election, and other sort of discourse that I can't even begin to describe. And this is very, very systematic. So legislation, policies, discourse, and behavior. And behavior is very important in the process of democratic recession. In the last year, many of us, I spent Pesach alone for the first time in my life. Without my family, without my children, without my grandchildren, first time in my life. And Mr. Netanyahu had his whole family with him. And there has to be something the matter going back to Joe and Migdal's very important presentation when there is such a discrepancy between rules and behavior, then something begins to unravel seriously. And that's part of this phenomenon as well.
Well, we're over time again, but I'll just pose two quick questions if you can give like very quick answers to. One is from my colleague Yore Kedem, and I think that would also be for you, Naomi, although everyone on the panel could answer, is whether there's a risk in democratic societies when you have kind of the multiplicity and pluralism that kind of allows for illiberal views that you might see perhaps among some sectors of the Haredim, and what are the tensions there between the pluralism that essentially also allows illiberalism to some extent. And then secondly, I think it was to you, Joel, from my colleague Ken Walzer, whether you could maybe elaborate on some of the ongoing, rather than divergences between epochs, also continuities and their links to kind of waves of immigration. So I think you alluded to that, but if you can elaborate on, I don't know if I'm.
Could you repeat the question?
Whether there are also kind of more continuities among historical epochs, and whether they are linked to ongoing kind of waves or impacted by ongoing waves of migration and incorporation that might influence those to also create continuities and kind of the framework. So those are both very big questions. And if you guys can give kind of short answers to those large questions, and then we'll take a 10-minute break.
Right. Should I start?
Yes, that would be marvelous.
You can rest for a moment. Yeah, so there definitely are continuities from across epochs, and I appreciate the question, Ken. I will say this. One of the themes that I've tried to look at is how societies, how continuity is broken and when. And what you find is that long-lasting wars that really not only have tremendous destruction on the front, but reorder the home front. And this, in America's case, there were two wars like that. That was the Civil War and World War II. They will often break the continuity. And it was after the Civil War, really, that you began to have the incorporation of immigrants into society and into the capitalist society. And it was after World War II, not surprisingly, that you had the civil rights movement and the women's movement really gaining steam, sort of knocking on the door and trying to break the exclusivity of the very narrowly defined public or nation. So there is continuity, but there are also important breakpoints.
And I'll try to answer the first question in a typically Jewish manner, if I may. The question related to the fact that isn't too much pluralism actually problematic in democratic societies? And the first question I want to raise is, when does what's the difference between pluralism and polarization? When do we transition to polarization? And I think in many democratic societies today, the problem is polarization. And polarization, frankly, is one of the greatest enemies of pluralism. It really is. And what we're dealing with are deeply divided societies, not necessarily sociologically, but in terms of mindset and approaches. And that kind of polarization is very pernicious. So that's question number one. And question number two is, democracies are about disagreement. And the way one deals with a disagreement is by agreeing on certain rules or certain norms or certain values. So what are the values that bind the groups together? Or if you move to what Joel talked about so deliciously, really is a pleasure, how does one build a public? One builds a public around certain kinds of practices that then embrace a diversity. So how does one maintain that and not see it either fragment or, in many cases, separate into 2 blocks or 3 blocks, which is what's been happening, unfortunately, in Israel.
Can I just say a word more? I agree 100% with what Nomi was saying, and I just want to add a word to it. Part of what a democracy depends upon is that when people see something, whatever it is, an event, that they basically see the same thing, and then they can disagree about what to do about it, what it means, how to handle it. But when people look at something like the election in the United States on November 3rd, and they see 2 different things entirely, there's no way that you can have a kind of pluralist democracy at work. What you have is exactly what Nomi said, which is this kind of polarization, inability to talk to each other, no rules for interaction.
Ilan, did you want to?
Yeah, I would like to add one comment about pluralism. And I think that what we have seen in Israel over the last 2 months about the impact of pluralism, to my way of thinking, is very, very positive. Okay, my presentation was generally quite bleak, but what I would like to say is when Netanyahu started to court the Arab vote, he did it because of electoral causes. He did not do it.
Totally cynical.
Yeah, very cynical. Everybody knows it. I don't think that Netanyahu himself would even deny it. But nevertheless, the result has been that all of the parties, including Meretz and lots of others, have put a lot more emphasis on the Arab vote. I would like to put it again, one sentence in the context of comparison. In the United States of America, Joe Biden would never have been president of the United States without the black vote. And you can look at the black vote as against the Arab votes, percentage-wise, more or less similar kind of thing, 15, 20% of the population. And you can see that within a democratic structure, if you need to court the minorities, this could sometimes, as a byproduct, have very positive results. And that's on a positive way, I would put this in.
So thank you for allowing us to end on a positive note with lots of dire legitimate concerns. So we'll take a 10-minute break for the whole symposium. I think it'll continue to be really stimulating as it has been. So Saliba, you're going to get us started, right? Yeah.
Yes, please. Yes, thank you very much. It's a great privilege and honor to be chairing this last session, last but not least. And this session will focus on national memory, memorialization, and dramatization. The three speakers, I will introduce each of them separately as they begin their presentation. The first one is Dr. Yael Zerubbabel, and she is Professor Emerita of Jewish Studies and History at Rutgers University and the former founding director of the Bildner Center for the Study of Jewish Life. She has published extensively in the areas of collective memory and identity, political myths, Israeli culture, war and trauma, and symbolic landscapes. She is the author of the award-winning Recovered Roots, Collective Memory, and the Making of the Israeli National Tradition, and Desert in the Promised Land. She has co-edited several works such as History and Memory, and she is the recipient of the 2019 Lifetime Achievement Award in Israel Studies from the Association for Israel Studies and the Israel Institute. Yael, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I think that the wide range of topics that are discussed in this symposium is a testimony to Mike's breadth of interest, and we are now moving from the politics to political culture to memory. And I would even mention that Mike had literary interests, and so you will see how these converge in the talk that I would give. I just want to mention that I first met Mike in my very first participation at the annual meeting of the Association for Israel Study when I was a very young and fresh PhD. And here we are now both emeriti professors. But in the middle, we were colleagues at Rutgers, and Mike was really enormously helpful to me then in building the Center and the Department of Jewish Studies. I also benefited from his scholarship in the Recovered Roots, from his work on national myth and collective memory, and then went back in my work on the desert as a symbolic landscape to his earlier work that Joel reminded us of, the frontier towns. So there are a lot of intersections along the way. So my article for this volume focused on Meir Shalev's book, Tanakh Achshav, the Bible Now, which was published in 1985 and was greeted as a turning point in Israeli culture. The book, whose chapters drew on Shalev's column in Haaretz, was hailed as the first serious circular commentary midrash by an Israeli writer. Now, this article is actually part of a much broader project that I'm engaged in now on the role of the Bible in contemporary Israeli culture. And so it only one slice, and by no means, sums up the diversity of approaches. I call this study Biblical Reenactments and the Performance of Antiquity in Israeli Culture. I would not deal, but just mention that in Zionist Hebrew culture of the pre-state period, the Bible was really raised to an enormous, the key sacred text that legitimized the Zionist project and played an important role in the construction of national memory and the foundations of modern Hebrew culture. And this in itself is even more than one lecture, but I'm just jumping ahead to the mid-90s, 1980s, when the book that I'm analyzing was published. And at that point, the status of the Bible actually suffered from erosion due to numerous factors, and just alluding to them briefly, a widening gap between biblical Hebrew and the modern spoken and literary Israeli Hebrew. The Bible has become less accessible to the younger generations. Growing politicization of the Bible in the post-1967 era, due to the right's expansionist agenda and its use of the Bible, leading to alienation from the Bible by opponents of this policy, and the growing secular religious tensions within Israeli society. May Shelif writes clearly that his goal in writing the Bible now is to legitimize secular Israelis' right to reclaim the love of the Bible, which is Ahavat HaTanach, very important phrase in Hebrew education, without being bound to a religious point of view, to centuries-old commentaries, or to academic training. His wish is to help secular Israelis rediscover the appeal of the Bible and its relevance to their lives. As he writes in his introduction, and I quote, "My Bible is a different Bible. Its writers and characters are flesh and blood. It is not written by God, and its heroes are neither pure nor saintly. I do not have a scholar's education or a traditional commentator's motivation. For me, the Bible is an exciting and a thought-provoking book which I love to read. It contains sufficient doses of politics, love, faith, and thought to make any reader reflect on what happens around him today. This is the spirit in which I've written this book." Shelif does not relate to the Bible as historical or religious document, but as a literary repository of collective memory that continues to offer a venue for a dialogue between the past and the present, which is the hallmark of collective memory. He uses in his writing two literary strategies that I focus on. One is contemporization, which means taking out past figures and events, to take them out of their historical period and applying to them contemporary views and sensibilities. And this is articulated in the title that he chose, Tanakh Achshav, the Bible Now. And then he uses another strategy, which is really not as much foregrounded, and this is archaization, which means referring to contemporary events or figures as if they took place in the ancient past. Either choice introduces an anachronistic framework that is obviously a no-no for historians, but is permitted in the domain of memory. And it highlights the Bible as a timeless symbolic text that is open for such maneuvers. The use of these techniques, contemporization and archaization, is not new. I mean, traditional commentators also use this tactic. What is new about Shelif's work is the application of a highly secularist approach and the introduction of a humorous framework. So for instance, at the level of language, Shelif replaces the high register of biblical Hebrew with contemporary colloquial expressions, such as political terms. He uses deputy minister and opposition, oppositia, in his so-called biblical analysis, or religious and military terms such as chief rabbi and military summon, tzav giyus, or foreign words that are adapted into Israeli Hebrew, such as protection, protectia, and consensus. And that he uses in the midst of his analysis of the biblical text. And of course, it introduces humor because of the incongruity between contemporary modern terms and the biblical text. Now, his humor ranges from very light and to a more biting humor. I'll give you an example of the lighter approach. When he provides in a chapter on the book of Ruth, he alludes to the economic hardships that Ruth and Naomi face upon returning to their land from exile. And Shelif cynically remarks, well, in those days, they did not provide returning residents with special privileges. And so, of course, this is created an immediate shift, a temporal shift. But in his chapter on the book of Job, he reverts to much more radical contemporization and sharper sarcasm, as he alludes to God as a researcher who violates the basic ethical standards of studying human subjects that every academic is bound to. And he alludes to God as a researcher, and he notes that God's tendency is to be carried away by excessive scientific zeal, as happened in the trial of Abraham around the binding of Isaac. Shelif further criticizes God's replies to Job as a communication failure, keshel hasbarati in Hebrew, leading him to, I quote, to recommend that to the Almighty the next time he finds better speech writers to carry his message. So challenges of the book of Job have been abundant in Jewish tradition, but not from that perspective, and not challenging God, in such a satirical and sarcastic way. And of course, trying to explain it in other ways. In a chapter entitled The Burial of the Opposition, Shelif describes the biblical episode relating to Korach and his people, who challenged Moses' leadership and are punished when the earth opens up and swallows them and all their families and property. Now, Shelif begins this by actually shifting this particular scene to the framework of contemporary Israeli Knesset. And he does here the counter move. And he says, clearly democracy was not in vogue in those days. Now, in another bold act of contemporization, which will be the last example I give, he quotes the biblical verse, better a poor but wise youth than an old but foolish king who no longer has the sense to heed warnings. And after a very long discussion of the biblical context of different older leaders, he ends up with his punchline, and I quote, how is it that the recommendations of the Kahan committee got into the fourth chapter of Ecclesiastes? I cannot answer this question. Perhaps biblical scholars will be able to look into this issue. Without mentioning by name Prime Minister Menachem Begin, this comment makes it clear to the readers in the aftermath of the War of Lebanon to whom he refers, and this contemporary analogy was the reason behind the selection of this particular verse. Now, the case of Tanakh Achshav, the Bible Now, provides an interesting venue to examine the working of cultural memory, not only because of the popularity and literary success of the book, but also because of its reception as a turning point in Israeli political culture as the first secular midrash, as I quoted earlier. Now, I have to say, Bible Now is not the first book that was written as a secular book, and it's not the first one to use as the framework of political satire. But it is one of the forerunners of the renewed secular claim to Jewish texts, or what is known in Hebrew as Aronoff Hayehudi, the Jewish bookcase, that also led to the establishment of secular academies of learning, yeshivot, batei midrash chiloniyim, and diversity of public and television and radio programs and books featuring commentaries on the Torah portions by writers, scholars, and cultural figures. Now, this by no means represents a uniform approach among the so-called secular Israelis, and indeed one can argue that this particular category obscures a wide range of attitudes to Jewish tradition among those who depart or are different from those who have the Orthodox perspective. And the study of the biblical representations in contemporary Israeli culture becomes a very productive lens to examine this process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yael. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Dr. Roland Vasquez, Professor of Anthropology and Social Science at Upper Iowa University. He received his doctorate in anthropology at Rutgers under the direction of Dr. Aronoff. His research interests include Basque and Spanish politics, especially links between institutional realities and culture. His politics, culture, and sociability in the Basque Nationalist Party is an ethnographic study of Basque partisan competition. He is currently working on an ethnography focusing on the political culture of post-terrorism in Basque society, with special attention to the victims of the ETA. Roland, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to first say, before I forget, that it's a real honor, and I think more than an honor, it's a joy to have been asked to participate in this forum, and this salute to Mike Aronoff, which is well deserved. After nearly 4 years of deliberation in the multiplicity of victims' issues, the Basque Special Commission chose Cristina Iglesias as the artist for the parliamentary victim sculpture. Iglesias's Basque roots and reputation in the global art scene rendered her the candidate for the task on what basically amounted to a short list of one. She had studied art in London and had pieces in prestigious galleries and major museums. She had been picked to represent twice in the Venice Biennial and had received Spain's National Prize for Plastic Arts in 1999. Her combination of Basque birth, Madrid area residence, and cosmopolitan experience and exposure was itself highly symbolic of the local, state, European, global conjuncture, thus emphasizing an open, modern, non-tribal Basqueness. Also on Iglesias's resume was that she had been the first Basque artist to have had an exhibition dedicated exclusively to her work by the Guggenheim. This fact only added to her cachet and near unique localizability in the local global artistic nexus, but most importantly, provided the members of the Special Commission with direct familiarity of her work. In contrast to other Basque artists, Iglesias had been absolutely silent about Basque or Spanish political dynamics. Even with respect to her aesthetic focus, Miguel Ángel Hidalgo Garcia argues for a lack of external reference in Iglesias's work, except perhaps in technique. In form and function alike, her art was above the political fray. One noteworthy motif in Iglesias's work has been her consistent allusion to memory. For example, Within the publication that accompanied the Guggenheim exhibition, art critic Nancy Princenthal invokes Freud's term screen memories to qualify the artist's corpus. Along these lines, Iglesias's own estimation of her work in a 2011 interview is resolute. Quote, "My works always recall something that we have lived," unquote. This gravitation towards memory dovetails with parliamentary desires for the project. For example, the same 2005 non-binding resolution that reaffirmed parliamentary commitment to a sculpture at the building's entrance also stressed, quote, "the effective insertion of public recognition into collective memory," end quote, as well as proclaiming that, quote, "memory rescues the gaze of the victims," end quote. In spite of her prior Guggenheim exhibition, only 2 of Iglesias's pieces are part of the museum's permanent collection. Members of the Special Commission would have seen one of these on their individual museumistic pilgrimages, and it would have made an impression upon them. Untitled Celosía No. 2. The celosías represent one of a few prominent Iglesias series. The word celosía itself is Spanish. As in the French jalousie, there is a double entendre or even multiplicity of meanings, including jealousy and a blind or shutter made of a row of angled slats. Iglesias's celosías are a type of artistic lattice structure that not only provides intimacy, but also serves as a filter for reality. One characteristic of the pieces in Iglesias' celosías series, up to that point at least, is that they were all untitled. Another is the artist's propensity to place texts within the lattice, which provides suggestions as to the piece's meaning. The new celosía was to have the Basque title Gauérdico y Paroratza, in Spanish Brújula de la Medianoche, in either case Midnight Compass. It would be comprised of 3 celosías of terracotta in the form of a labyrinth. As with other pieces in her celosía series, Iglesias inserted text within the lattice structure. The excerpt selected was from the 1677 work by Pérez Echeverri called "This Book is About Sea Navigation." Echeverri's book takes as its point of departure an earlier work, originally published in 1579 by Martín Oyarzábal, which was quite possibly the first book written down to guide transatlantic navigation, to describe places and distances, and was used extensively by sailors making the crossing, especially those from France and Spain in their trips to Newfoundland. Prior to the publication of the Echeverri treatise, most written work in Basque addressed Roman Catholicism. His was one of only 2 technical manuals written in the Basque language throughout the entirety of the 17th century, with the other focusing on veterinary medicine. Furthermore, Echeverri's treatise is indicative of a very Basque presence in New France in the 17th century through toponyms and other factors, a presence that was largely erased in the subsequent French historiography. Echeverri's text is the only source documenting the early Basque presence to such an extent in Newfoundland. It shows itself to be in a political field in which a community of Basque sailors sought to defend its collective interests in the face of the more powerful French across continents. I would distill the lessons embedded in Echeverri's treatise into the following. A staunch assertion of identity through linguistic affirmation and collective action. Courage, intelligence, and capacity for exploration where others have yet to tread. Ability to outmaneuver the more powerful, even from a position of disadvantage. Respect for an honest treatment of the disempowered, and the willingness to include all. An understanding of collective memory, suggesting its endurance and the potential for its recovery, even in the face of perverting forces. And, most importantly, a sense of how constant awareness of one's bearings is what makes all of the above possible. All of these elements fold into a symbolism of knowing which way to go, both literally and figuratively, and on a collective level, a clear moral compass to be able to steer through trials and tribulations in order to arrive at the necessary destination. This latter point is highlighted by Iglesias, the sculptor, in the title of her sculpture. The fact that this work would be the first in the Seleucia series to actually have a title itself hints at the importance of that title. Moreover, Midnight Compass refers to Polaris, the North Star. In the dark of night, when navigation might be rendered its most difficult, this star was seen to provide a fixed point of reference, always allowing the navigator to maintain his bearings. The directional implications of Echeverry's text and Iglesias's title are accentuated by the way in which the letters from the text are inserted into the body of the Seleucia, themselves serving the physical function of coordinates by pointing the way. From the moment of its debut, Midnight Compass would become the ur-text of a Basque institutional aesthetic for the current century, as well as subsequently becoming the neurological center for the Basque government's 2011 Map of Memory project, which recognized, cataloged, and promoted sculptures, monuments, parks, and other key victim landmarks to form what they called an ethical map throughout Basque territory. For better or worse, there can be ways in which the state or the polity sees. Likewise, in which institutions think. And even more pertinent here, there are ways in which institutions feel and act upon such feelings in arenas ranging from social programs to expressive culture. Holding to such a position is not about the naive imputation of singular motivations upon collective entities. It is, rather, consistent with the recognition of the necessarily dialectical relationship between politics and culture, a relationship forcefully argued for by Mike Aronoff before it was fashionable to invoke power at all in anthropological circles or culture in any way transcending a template of values in political science. In his book, Art Worlds, Howard Becker approaches the sociology of art by suggesting that it is not an individual, but rather a community that makes art. I interpret Becker effectively to be saying that it takes a village to raise a sculpture. In the case of Midnight Compass, however, I would argue that ultimately it is the Basque polity that has done so. And that's what I have, but I will just add 1 to 1.5 more sentences saying that in the event that it's not clear, and I would hope that it is, that my interpretation is permeated by reflections upon memory and reflections upon political culture that I first learned about in a political anthropology seminar at Rutgers University. And I'd like to just thank Mike again and say thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you, Roland, very much. At this point, we welcome Professor Jan Kubik, who will speak on Tadeusz's Kantor's theater as an antidote against the excesses of nationalism and idiocy of state socialism. And let me introduce to you Dr. Kubik. He is professor in the Department of Political Science at Rutgers and professor of Slavonic and East European Studies at University College London. He works on the rise of right-wing populism, culture and politics, civil society, protest politics and social movements, and communist and post-communist politics. Among his publications are The Power of Symbols Against the Symbols of Power, Anthropology and Political Science with Myron Aronoff, 20 years after communism, The Politics of Memory and Commemoration with Michael Bernhardt. He is the 2020 president of the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies and the recipient of the 2018 Distinguished Achievement Award from the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences in America. And Professor Kubik, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this introduction. Very kind. And I will talk a little bit more about Mike than Tadeusz Kantor. I decided to celebrate him, but I hope you will see how much I owe him and how much what I've put in this chapter is the result of being Mike's collaborative friend and being mentored by him. So my personal, I would be looking at my notes that are on the screen, above the screen, when you see me. So my relationship with Mike, often to a large degree, friendship, very close, is intimately intertwined with my professional development. So I will tell you the story in 4 acts. The act number 1, the first encounter. I was in graduate school at Columbia studying anthropology, and I was specializing in symbolic anthropology, as it was called these days, and political anthropology. Political anthropology was about basically 2 things. One was the study of the evolution of political institutions, for example, the state, and about informal dimension of institutions. So that was political anthropology. Then on the other hand, there was my interest and my work in symbolic anthropology, which was about symbols, rituals, narratives, myths, and things like that. And somehow I didn't have a connection between the 2. And then there was a seminar to which we were inviting scholars from the outside, and Mike came for one of those seminars. And while I was listening to him, that was the eureka moment, because he put those 2 together for me. And from that moment, I started seeing them together, that they go together. And I guess our common interest emerged, or Mike obviously had it, the relationship between power and meaning, or politics and culture. So that's the act number 1. Then a few years later, the act number 2, I call it Mike's mentorship. And it was about my career choice. So after graduation, I went to work in a replacement job in a small college in Ohio. It was a very uncertain situation. 89 came, communism fell. I was working on legitimacy of the communists. That was the title of the work on my dissertation. And in 1990, I managed to secure a grant, and I went to Poland to study the post-communist transformations in the mountains of southern Poland. And information came that the job opened at Rutgers, and it was a job in political science. I really didn't want to go to political science. I wanted to stay in anthropology. I submitted the papers. I was selected for an interview, and I was hesitating. I didn't know what to do. And it was extremely complicated to communicate. I'm pretty sure Mike remembers that. I was in the mountains of Poland after communism. It took sometimes days to get a connection. You had to book a telephone connection. And Mike was relentless. So I, for example, received a telegram, which is one of my prized possessions. Oh, this doesn't work very well, but that's the telegram. I still have it, that I received from him. Then there were some calls through my wife's aunt through Greensboro in North Carolina. It was absolutely crazy. But one way or another, Mike informed me that I'm an idiot. That I'd never forget it. Once he informed me that I'm an idiot, it shook me enough that I decided to get on the plane and fly to New Jersey from the Polish mountains and do the job talk at Rutgers. So that's the style of Mike's mentorship. How should I describe it? It was often direct, which was very healthy and was kind of helping to sometimes wake up from some kind of stupor in one way or another. The third act is working together. We've done a lot of things together, and I have the fondest memory of those, and Yael was a part of some of those. I am always eternally grateful to her. I was the director of the Center for European Studies. She was running the Bildner Center. We did actually two seminar series together. But the first one was very interestingly about the similarities and differences between Israeli politics and East European politics. That was the first one. And Mike and I were running this one together. So when we worked together, several themes emerged that became central in our work, which eventually led to our common book. Very quickly, culture is a contested terrain. Symbolic systems such as nationalism, religion are multivocal and can always be interpreted in many different ways, and it is a thoroughly political process, which way it goes. Power and culture are intimately intertwined. Therefore, the central concepts for us have always been hegemony and counter-hegemony. However weak, there's always some degree of counter-hegemony somewhere in the society, in its culture. Next, politics cannot exist without rituals. And of course, that was Mike's book, Israeli Visions and Divisions. Mythology, which led us to the question, what is modernity? What's the difference between pre-modern, modern times, post-modern? Are there any continuities? And that informs my work till today, because I'm working now on the role of mythology in populist discourse in the project that I call the Escape from Reason. And then method, right? So we spend a lot of time in the book. There's a big chapter on ethnography and extended case study method, which Mike learned firsthand in Manchester from Max Gluckman. And I learned from Mike and others, and that's still the key method I am using. So the next chapter, the fourth chapter in this quick story is our book. And the book was called Anthropology and Political Science and Convergent Approach. Joel wrote a review for which we are still very grateful. And thank you so much again, Joel, for that. It certainly boosted our confidence that we did something on the right path, at least. And the idea for the book, and I think it is important to know, however silly it sounds, simplistically, but when you're constructing something, you want to have simple rules. Mike was looking for culture in politics. I remember when we kind of decided it, and I was looking more for politics and culture. And those were kind of the driving ideas. Of course, we were interchanging, but it kept us going with this very simple notion. So that was, of course, helping me to continue my interest in the arts, particularly in theater, in visual arts, which I had since I studied sociology of art in Krakow at the Jagiellonian University. And this is something that helps me, drives my work until today, and it is extremely useful because I see the rise of right-wing populism, which is a form of fascism, although there's a discussion around those terms, not just as a political process, but as a deeply and in a very complex way, cultural process. There are some dramatic changes in those societies. Those are not just, it is not just an issue of party politics or this or that mobilization of right-wing groups. There are some very deep and very scary changes observed in many different parts of the world, as was already mentioned. So those tools that we developed in the book, I am still using many of them. It is enough to mention what Naomi Chazan mentioned, the question of polarization. It is a discursive cultural polarization, and I completely agree with your point, Naomi, that this is not a sociological phenomenon. Societies remain sort of diverse, some sense pluralistic, but those dramatic polarizing frames are imposed on them, and they lead to political polarization also, and the results we see all over again. And another thing, when Joel was talking about the public space, the virtue of the public space must be civility. And there's an approach to populists, particularly right-wing populists, that treats it as a certain cultural style. And that style is described as antithesis of civility, basically. And that also has tremendous political repercussions. And well, and at the end, let me just say a few words about the chapter. So the chapter is about Tadeusz Kantor, who was an amazing visual artist, one of the first performative artists, and then the creator of the theater. In the second half of the 20th century, Polish theater was among the most influential theaters in the world due to Jerzy Grotowski and Tadeusz Kantor. And what can I say about him in like 1-2 minutes? He was challenging the notion of the stability taken for grantedness of nationalism. And he was doing it at the highest possible artistic level. You know, last time I saw his production was in La Mama in New York. And he was challenging what was a basic idiom, both for communists and Catholics, for the Catholic Church, which was nationalism. In my first book, I wrote about the competition between communist or state socialist nationalism and Catholic nationalism. Kantor was showing that it doesn't need to be like that. The world can be constructed differently, meaning that he was dealing with the question, which is very much also of interest in our book with Mike, which is the question of scale. What is the relationship between the local, national, and international? And nationalists, by definition, working at the national level, try to swallow all the differences, all the localities of local imaginations under one umbrella of national identity. Kantor was showing basically that you can sort of move from local to universal, to something that is simply about all of us sharing common humanity, and that nationalists can be challenged in their attempt to stop that progress, sort of from local to transnational or universal. And I think in essence, this is the project that allows us to think through the possibilities, how to challenge or how to go around nationalism, which of course is the major weapon of right-wing populists everywhere. So Mike, thank you again for all of this. The story is a little bit longer and more complex than I can do in 12 minutes, but I am an eternal debt to you, and I love you.
Jan, thank you very, very much for your presentation. Terrific mixing of biographies and scholarly pursuits. I also would like to add as an introduction to Mike, to Dr. Myron Aronoff, the fact that I was sitting in his senior seminar one day and he said, we're going to have a peace conference and you are going to be Sadat for the duration. And so there are others in the room who acted as other leaders. And that, in a sense, led me to then correspond with Sadat and write my dissertation on him. And then that led me ultimately to seek peace and peace building and peacemaking and distinguishing between those two elements and how they can be combined in the pursuit of social justice and so on. In a sense, Mike has used his voice and his touch to impact the lives of his students. And I so much appreciated what Naomi and Yossi and others, Jan and so on, Roland, who spoke about how he has inspired them, but at the same time, he was their teacher and he is their teacher. And so with that, let me just introduce to you formally through a short bio of Mike so he can say a few words about the book, about anything he would like to share. Myron J. Aronoff is the Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Political Science, Anthropology, Jewish Studies at Rutgers. His PhD in anthropology is from the University of Manchester, and his PhD in political science is from UCLA. He devoted his professional career to building conceptual and methodological bridges between political science and anthropology. Professor Aronoff is the author of Frontier Town, The Politics of Community Building in Israel, Power and Ritual in the Israel Labor Party, and Israeli Visions and Divisions, Cultural Change and Political Conflict. He co-authored Anthropology and Political Science, A Convergent Approach, and edited Freedom and Constraint, a memorial tribute to Max Gluckman and the series of Political Anthropology. Professor Aronoff was awarded the first Lifetime Achievement Award in Israel Studies from the Association for Israel Studies and the Israel Institute in recognition of your outstanding scholarship and contributions to the study of Israel. In 2018, he was awarded the Albert Nelson Marius Lifetime Achievement Award. Mike, go ahead. You are welcome to share your comments.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yes, okay. Those of you on the panel know me many years and know that I'm not normally at a loss for words. But believe me when I say words fail me to express my deep appreciation, gratitude at this unbelievable honor that you have bestowed upon me in editing and contributing to this fest script. Rather than try to sort of summarize my epilogue in this volume, in which I refer to each and every one of your contributions and try to relate it to some of my own work, I would like to, for the benefit primarily of the audience of the symposium rather than the contributors to it, just read one brief definition that first appeared in Israeli Visions and Divisions, because I think many of you outside of the specialists are not quite sure what we may mean by political culture. Political culture is far more tenuous than it is generally portrayed. And here I borrow a metaphor from Clifford Geertz, the great American anthropologist Clifford Geertz's wonderful volume, Interpretations of Culture. It is like a fragile web of symbolic themes that is constantly being stretched in opposite directions by conflicting interpretations. The myths that crown power with legitimacy are constantly threatened by iconoclasts who call into question and undermine them. Old truths are constantly reinterpreted as political realities change and new cultural traditions are invented by myth makers who drape emergent groups with the mantle of authority. Political culture, like all culture, is an illusion that is essential for the survival of society and civilizations. Like other modern nations, Israel claims to be the opposite of novel, namely rooted in the remotest antiquity, and the opposite of constructed, namely a human community so natural as to require no definition other than self-assertion. Its political culture is particularly vulnerable because so many within and without its borders challenge this claim. I also want to take this opportunity, since so many of you have so generously paid me the honor of calling me your teacher, your mentor, to single out three mentors I've had in my professional career. David C. Rappaport, a political theorist and political scientist at UCLA, who at age 90 is completing the final volume of his multi-volume masterpiece on terrorism. The late Michael, by the way, the greatest, although I studied all of the great political philosophers with David, what he really taught me was to ask interesting questions. More than Plato, Aristotle, how ask interesting questions, as I remember David driving it to me. The late Michael G. Smith was my professor mentor in the anthropology department at UCLA. And beside the two things that really made a strong imprint on me from Michael's many seminars I took with him was, first of all, a total fascination with ethnography, that I felt I needed to do field work to do what I really wanted to do. And I turned down a tenure track job at a very respectable university in order to take a ridiculously skimpy English studentship to Manchester, because Max Gluckman was looking for people to go to Israel, and I had prepared myself, as did my colleague Naomi, as an Africanist. And I spent more courses studying Africa at UCLA and in Manchester than, I don't know, possibly any other graduate student, and never wrote a word on it. And that's because of serendipity. I was invited to teach at Tel Aviv University and was told I had to have one service course for the department, and then I could teach whatever I wanted. And ultimately, my service course was a major compulsory course for all students in the social sciences on Mishtar Medinat Yisrael, Israeli government and politics. I had never taken a course in either of the two undergraduate institutions or the two graduate institutions that I studied on Israel, because they weren't offered. So quite serendipitously, I became a specialist on Israeli culture and politics. But Max was a fascinating character, and I wrote I edited a volume called Freedom and Constraint, a memorial tribute to Max Gluckman. He was an incredibly interesting person. But he once told me that he had learned very little from his students. And that kind of shocked and upset me. But I knew for a fact that I had taught him one thing, and that was I had applied his concept of rituals of rebellion, which he had used among traditional African people, to the Israel Labor Party. And while he was reading the manuscript, that every time I said ritual, he would put it in quotation marks or add a hyphen, ritual-like, because he insisted that, and he had written in his classic essay, one cannot have a ritual of rebellion in even in a proto-state society, much less in a modern democratic, or at least ostensibly democratic society such as Israel. And I made my arguments very systematically with Max, and I think the sign of a good student-teacher relationship is one can argue, and finally convinced him, which I won't go into the details, so he said, ultimately I could stop using quotation marks or hyphen, that what I had actually analyzed was a ritual of rebellion. But anyway, and as Jan mentioned, I think the most important thing I learned at Manchester was the extended case analysis, which is looking at the interactions of people over a period of time in different contexts. And so I think, frankly, I have learned as much, if not more, from my students and my colleagues as I have learned from my professors. And this is a debt of gratitude to all of you and others. I do want to read one last quotation that concludes my contribution, the epilogue to this book that we're discussing, because I think it is so apropos to the spirit of this book and this discussion. It's from the Pirkei Avot, which in English is the wisdom of the fathers, or the sages, possibly more loosely translated. As it's written, learning is acquired by the scholar who concentrates on his study, is capable of intellectual give and take, is capable of adding to what he has learned, studies in order to teach, and studies in order to practice, makes his teachers wiser, is exact in what he has learned, and quotes his source. Thus thou dost learn that whoever quotes his source brings deliverance to the world. And that to me is basically my whole understanding of what academia is all about. We are in a process of constantly exercising our curiosity, trying to understand the phenomena that intrigue us. We teach and we learn from those whom we teach, as well as in the process of teaching. And certainly, as I say, I never, ever formally studied a single course on modern Israel, and have spent my whole life researching, writing, and teaching about it. So as Yael and my family all know, one of my favorite words in the English language is serendipity. And that has been perhaps the most important process which has governed my life and my career. So from the bottom of my heart, my gratitude of thanks for the honor that you have bestowed upon me, and to the audience who still remain on Zoom for their patience and consideration. Thank you.
Thank you to all of you. It has been really fulfilling I think for all of us to do this book and to have a chance to kind of discuss the book with each other and with a large audience of 114 people from all over the world. So thank you so much to all of you. And of course, my dad. It's a great privilege and honor to do this as well. Thanks to all of you, and thanks for your time when we're all zoomed out. Stay healthy and stay safe, and
Amen.
Let's hope for the best in terms of trends towards democracy and peace. All right.